Sharper than a serpent's tooth. Written by the Hanged Man 317 and read by Purple Star. Chapter 36. Back off, Bakugo. After a mercifully brief 20 minutes, Hatsume finally wiped her brow and stepped from the ring. There was a confused moment of silence from the audience, as if they were unsure whether the match was truly over, or perhaps they half feared that this was yet another of the support students' tricks. Era stood from her seat and cupped her hands to her mouth, whooping from the general studies section. "Fuck yeah, Hatsume!" Honestly, what a show. That was the hardest that Era had laughed in a long while, and her cheeks ached with the unfamiliar stretch of such a wide smile. Fuck, she felt like she had a runner's stitch in her side as well. She never got those. At last, the crowd seemed to understand that the match had, indeed, ended, and the stadium burst into scattered cheers and applause. It was nowhere near as overwhelming as it had been in the aftermath of the fight previous, but Era figured that quite a few audience members had read the writing on the wall and taken the opportunity to get concessions or head to the bathroom. That pesky grin wormed its way onto her face once more. Absolutely fantastic. She didn't wish Ida any ill, of course. She'd have cheered on Hatsume toying anyone around the ring like that, in a masterful display of technological prowess and shrewd business sense. The net gun, Era thought, had been particularly amusing, although perhaps she was just predictable in that regard. It seemed like Present Mike was announcing the next match the moment the two contestants cleared the field. Maybe they were eager to get things moving again after it had grinded to such a standstill.
Okay! After that exciting display, it's time for the next round. First up, we have our explosive powerhouse from 1A. Our first-year rep with a bold claim to the gold, Bakugo Katsuki from the Hero Course.
Era felt her hands tighten against the metal railing as Bakugo entered the arena, and she forced them to relax with a long exhale. This match would be very simple. Either Bakugo would know Shinsou's quirk, or he wouldn't. And then it would be over.
Versus, you know him as the purple-haired mystery who placed second in the cavalry battle. From General Education, it's Shinsou Hitoshi!
As much as she respected Shinsou as a friend, and as much as he had improved over the last few weeks under Aizawa's tutelage, the fact remained that he was no match against, well, Present Mike's descriptor had been accurate enough. A powerhouse, like Bakugo. Not one-on-one like this. Not on a flat, concrete arena where there was no terrain to take advantage of. Era felt her nose wrinkle. Ridiculous. Expecting them to fight like this. Expecting it to be an adequate display of talent. Daylight heroes might have thrived on that sort of thing. The pageantry of a drawn-out slog. But the impracticality of it burned in her veins and set her fingers twitching against the railing. A real fight was more than just this glorified slugfest. Sure, Era could appreciate the spectacle of the thing, had participated in enough cage matches to know when that was what an audience wanted to see. But that was blood and bruises, broken bones and crooked teeth. That was a brawl. This was supposed to be their chance to show their skills as heroes. Era was the first to admit that she didn't have the best grasp on the subject, but wasn't a hero's goal to end fights as quickly and bloodlessly as possible? To do that required all the steps she'd been trained in. Scouting, stalking, striking only when the odds were most in her favor? Or perhaps she was viewing it all wrong. Perhaps heroes needed to be able to trust that they could fight no matter the odds. After all, lives wouldn't wait for the perfect conditions in which to save them. Either way, it didn't matter. Shinsou didn't have the skills to fight Bakugo in a head-on fight like this. If he didn't fall under his quirk, the match would be over just as quickly as if he did. The two contestants took their places at either side of the stage, and there was an exchanging of words that couldn't be heard over the roar of the crowd, eager for an exciting match after the oddity of the last one. They're going to be disappointed. Era could only hope that Shinsou was egging Bakugo on enough for a quick response.
Begin!
There was a bright flash of explosions. The thunderous crackling followed soon after, over which Era could just barely hear Bakugo's enraged scream.
Because I'm going to fucking roast your ass, you!
Era grinned, feeling the tension unspooling from her shoulders. On the field, she could swear that Shinsou sported a similar expression, albeit slightly more smug. She couldn't hear the command. She didn't need to. It was obvious enough. Bakugo Katsuki, dull-eyed and slack-faced, turned around and began to slowly shuffle his way over towards the edge of the arena. Over the buzz of the crowd, present Mike commentated with what Era knew must be faux shock. The man surely knew what Shinsou's quirk was already, and was just upping the drama to keep the crowd engaged and focused on what was happening in the match. She tilted her head, eyes focusing on the announcing booth. That man knew how to spin a narrative. Dangerous. This wasn't the time to worry about that. For the moment, present Mike was working in Shinsou's favor, twisting the specifics of Shinsou's power into a web of mystique and intrigue. A mysterious mental quirk was far more compelling. Oh shit, that was a good one. She needed to use that on Shinsou. Than a by-the-books description of Shinsou's quirk, its strengths and weaknesses. It made him more pleasing to the crowd, to the scouters, made them want to know more. This was to be expected. If UA was selling anything, then it was future heroes. They had to have their branding down to a science by now. What she didn't expect, however, was for Aizawa to cut into the commentary halfway through, as Bakugo slowly neared the edge of the arena.
This is why the entrance exams are illogical. Shinsou Hitoshi has a powerful quirk that is well suited for heroics. But because it does not work on machines, he was unable to properly demonstrate its effectiveness. Even with training, there was no way he could match Bakugo's destructive power.
There was a sound, much like shuffling paper. And Era stifled a grin at the image of Aizawa flipping through records like a schoolteacher. Well, she supposed he was technically a schoolteacher. Huh. What a concept.
Shinsou applied for the heroics course, but failed the entrance exam. He applied for general studies as well, which means he likely expected that this would be the outcome. The current system makes it that much harder for students with perfectly suitable quirks to even make it to the starting gate. Despite the fact that a quirk able to handle villains without heedless destruction is arguably the most suited for heroics.
Holy shit! He was really taking a stand on this, wasn't he? Was that even his job? Was that okay? Was he allowed to question the exam? And by extension, UA's authority like that? On the stage, Bakugo was moments away from stepping out of bounds. Briefly, Era wondered if Shinsou had ordered him to walk this slowly on purpose. If he'd planned this somehow.
All this to say,
Aizawa continued with a dull finality,
the judgment of quirks based on sheer destructive power is simply irrational. This match is a prime example of that. Here we have the top scorer in the heroics exam, forced out of the ring by someone who wasn't even able to pass.
As he finished, Bakugo took his last halting step, bringing him across the chalk-white outlines. He stood, still, like a puppet whose strings were still taut. Era repressed a shudder at the glassy look in his eyes, the way his arms hung limply at his sides, how he stood and stared and waited for the next direction. It wasn't the same Quirk. It wasn't. In fact, if he had had a quirk like this, then everything had the potential to be so much worse. The outcome was just so. It was razor wire around her throat, a hand pushing her head beneath murky water. It was the dark, the dreams, and the shadows. Era shook those thoughts from her head, like clinging strands of cobweb, watching with a blossoming grin as Midnight raised her hand into the air.
Bakugo is out of bounds, she declared. Shinsou is the winner.
All at once, the stadium burst into a cacophonous clamor that pressed against Era's ears and dug sharp nails across her spine. But none of that mattered now, because Shinsou won, and the crowd was cheering for him, and everyone was going to see what a great fucking hero that kid was going to be, and Bakugo fell from control in a fitful startle. Small explosions fizzling along his arms as he whirled around to find the match had already ended. He snarled, taking a single, menacing step towards Shinsou. It was very likely that this would not be a physical confrontation, that he was simply confused and angry and eager to take that out on the most convenient source of it all. Bakugo might have been violent, arrogant, far too convinced of his own superiority to survive in the world that Era knew, but to his credit, she'd never seen him go so far as to actually attack a fellow student. Overzealous in school-sponsored combat, perhaps, but she wasn't one to judge. All flash, no heat. She knew that. It didn't stop her pulling the rifle from her back, taking aim and firing off a shot, all in one fluid motion. The paintball whizzed past Bakugo's cheek, close enough that she was sure he felt it passing, splattering against the ground in a burst of bright yellow paint. Warning shot.
Don't fucking do it,
Era growled beneath her breath, though she knew he couldn't hear her. The gun was still pressed against her shoulder, her finger hovering lightly over the trigger.
Not a step. Don't ruin this for him. Don't touch him. Don't even look at him. I will fucking end you.
If any of her fellow general studies students hadn't been giving her a wide berth before, they certainly were now. A quick shuffle of movement, and suddenly there were at least 10 feet between her and the nearest person. Good. When it became clear that Bakugo, with much gnashing of teeth, was beginning to back off and head back out of the ring, Era slung her gun back around and hurried to the lower hallways inside the stadium, down a few stairs, dodging past unaware spectators and chattering students, tamping down on the
"They would have died. They would have..."
that reared its ugly head whenever she thought too hard about how easy it would have been to slip a knife between the ribs of anyone she passed. At last, she made it to a long hallway leading from the arena entrance, and caught a flash of purple hair vanishing around the corner. "Shinsou!" A pause, before purple hair peeked back into the hallway once more. "Era?"
Hey, good job.
Walking towards him, Era suddenly realized that she didn't have the first clue how to congratulate him. When she successfully completed a mission, she might have been rewarded in any number of ways depending on its difficulty. Better food, more time to rest, dreamless nights, a chance to go outside, a break from training. More often than not, though, there wasn't anything to reward. It was expected that she follow her orders and follow them well, as to do otherwise would mean failure, and failure was suffering. None of this knowledge applied here. Luckily, Shinsou saved her from any floundering by narrowing his eyes and lightly punching her on the shoulder. Hey, what was that for? Era didn't flinch, but she did rub at her shoulder dramatically, mostly to mask the strange warmth that bloomed out from the touch. I know you shot at Bakugo. He was scowling, but Era could see the twitch in his lips that meant he was holding back a smile. You're going to get yourself disqualified. She shrugged, noting how his eyes flickered to somewhere beyond her shoulder. Was someone else walking down the hall? Odd. She'd thought this area was reserved for students and faculty. Although, come to think of it, the next match was starting soon, so perhaps it was one of the competitors. Worth it. Besides, disqualifying me would be a little anticlimactic, don't you think?
That's a very confident assessment,
said an all-too-familiar voice behind her. Yikes. Era did not jump, but she did have to repress a wince as she turned to find Aizawa glaring down at her. She should have known. The other students were too loud to avoid her notice. If there was someone here, it had to be a pro. It's a correct one, she said simply, refusing to shrink beneath his gaze. That only had the effect of making Aizawa's eyes narrow further. Though before he spoke to her again, he instead turned to an increasingly wary-looking Shinsou.
Good job. You were able to manipulate your opponent into responding. That probably won't work in the next match, but keep your head and remember what I've taught you, and you'll be able to show everyone you're more than just a useful quirk.
Shinsou only tensed further, although he did manage to offer a strained smile.
I'll keep that in mind.
Aizawa sighed, placing a hand on Shinsou's shoulder and looking down at him with a stern expression.
You're doing well. No matter what happens, I'll be proud of you.
The tension fled from him at the touch, and Shinsou's smile turned more earnest before he pulled away and began to rub at the back of his neck.
Thank you, Sensei. I guess we should go back to our seats.
He shot Era a pointed glance, but Aizawa shook his head before she could follow.
You may go back. Suzuki.
Aizawa motioned for her to follow.
I'd like a word.
Great. Are you sure, Sensei? She asked as sweetly as she dared. I don't want to miss the other matches.
You're smart enough. I'm sure you can figure out a strategy for yourself without watching it live.
Era bit back a sharp retort, swallowing her objections and ducking her head into a nod.
See you later, Era,
said Shinsou with an almost pained expression. She met his gaze quizzically.
Yeah, see you later.
While Shinsou hurriedly made his way back to the seat, Aizawa continued down the hallway, obviously expecting her to follow. Sighing, she fell into step next to him, unsure if she was supposed to be saying something. Luckily for her, he was the first to break the silence.
I believe one of the conditions of letting you bring that thing was that you would use it responsibly, correct?
Responsibly? Era had to resist the urge to laugh. Instead, she simply tilted her head and offered her best approximation of an apologetic smile. "I'm sorry, sir. It seems like there was some sort of misfire. I'll make sure it doesn't happen again." His expression shifted. Less angry, more tired. Not for the first time, Era wondered what tell he was picking up on. Whether it was her face or her hands or her words, maybe? Was that the common thread?
I'm not angry with you. I'm disappointed that you would abuse your privileges like that.
He wasn't angry. That was a good thing. That meant there would be no cages or beatings or the dark. It was a good thing. But for some reason, Era felt a little nauseous. Felt an itching at the inside of her throat that had nothing to do with metal, flesh, rope, clutching, clenching, twitching, tightening. There was an itch at the inside of her throat that had nothing to do with the dark. It was pressing words to her tongue, eager to sweeten whatever had soured here, because something was wrong, and she hated it. At least, if he was mad, then he could just slap her around a bit and get it out of his system. It wasn't ideal, but it was a solution, and she didn't have a solution for this. Era's life was chaos. Tangled strands all bunched together in a mess of colors that they needed to set straight. The only way to pick the threads apart was problem and solution. Problem. She didn't know. He was disappointed in her. That shouldn't have been a problem, but it was, and she couldn't explain why. Disconcerting. Because she'd always had such a knack for identifying problems, especially ones that concerned her. Solution. This was even more hazy. Without a concrete problem, there was little to build upon. And still, that itching in her throat, begging her to say something, because he was just staring at her, and he looked so tired, and is that my fault? And so what if it is? It doesn't matter, and Bakugo was threatening him. Era finally snapped, surprised to find not only sizzling anger, but what sounded suspiciously like a whine beneath the harshness of her tone. I was just making him hesitate long enough to realize he needed to stop. I don't understand how that's wrong.
It's wrong because we gave you rules, and you didn't follow them.
Era winced in earnest, barely resisting the tug of
failure is suffering.
And
again, little bird.
I followed the rules. Not that it mattered. Sometimes the rules could change, like a rug being tugged from under her feet. And she would either have to adjust her footing or fall flat on her face. Such was the way of things. Aizawa just sighed.
Explain.
Explain? What was there to explain? If he thought that she had broken a rule, then that was his call, his decision. Or maybe, sometimes, Vulcan had liked to humiliate her like this. Force her to try and guess at what new rule she'd somehow broken. She resisted the urge to grind her teeth. No weaknesses. Powerloader Sensei gave me 3 rules, she said as clearly as she dared. Muttering would be no help, but speaking with too much confidence could be seen as a sign of disrespect. 1. Don't shoot anyone with a rifle from less than 5 meters away. Bakugo was much further than that. 2. don't hit anyone in the face. I only fired a warning shot. I had no intention of actually hitting him. And 3. Era hesitated. This had been the troublesome one. The rules she just knew would come back to bite her in the ass, because it didn't mean anything. It was a catch-all, an opportunity to punish any potential slip-ups. Powerloader Sensei said that he or any of the referees reserved the right to rescind the registration if things got out of hand. I diffused the situation. I did not escalate it. I don't think I broke that rule. That last sentence was a bold addition, and one she immediately regretted. This wasn't about her opinion.
You're focusing on the letter of the law, as opposed to the spirit.
Aizawa pulled out his bottle of eye drops to fiddle with the cap, and Era felt her expression shift to something incredulous before she smoothed it flat. The spirit, sir?
The intention of those rules was to create as safe a competition as possible for all the contestants. Obviously, there are going to be some injuries, but firing a gun from the stands is not acceptable.
It's just a paint gun. She wasn't sure why she was arguing, but judging by his body language, it almost seemed like he expected her to. And I didn't even hit him. I wasn't going to hit him.
What do you think would happen if everyone was permitted to bring a paint gun into the festival, and to fire it whenever they saw fit?
Era paused. I don't see the relevance. That would obviously be bad, but that isn't what happened. I'm the only person with a gun, and I only shot it because...
Some rules could be broken by 1 or 2 people, and it wouldn't be a big deal. That doesn't mean you can just do whatever you want, even if you feel like it's justified. Our actions have consequences, especially as heroes.
Consequences. Always fucking consequences. Era was intimately familiar with the concept, although he picked a rather roundabout way of explaining it. I understand. Aizawa eyed her skeptically.
Do you?
Fuck. Why did he always do this? It was so much easier to get something wrong when he was forcing her to talk. Yes, I shouldn't have fired at Bakugo.
A safe answer,
he said with a sigh, and Era resisted the urge to grimace.
Why was it wrong?
Because shooting people is wrong, even if you're not going to hit them? Wow, that sounded stupid even as she was saying it. Wait, no, let me try again.
You're guessing,
said Aizawa, monotone.
You have no idea.
It was wrong because now I'm being forced to have this conversation. I know. I understand. I won't do it again.
It's not a matter of not doing it again. Your intentions were good, but your methods were flawed. I want you to know why it was wrong, so you understand how to go about solving a similar problem the next time it comes up.
That seemed incredibly complicated. Couldn't he just tell her what not to do? That would make things so much easier. Because...
Please stop trying to guess. We'll talk about this later.
He sounded exhausted, like he was just as sick of this conversation as she was. So, why were they still having it?
You've been doing well so far, but you can't brute force your way through every match. I thought you might get knocked out by Kaminari in the first match.
Era glanced at him from the corner of her eye, but didn't manage to catch any sign of his intention, a warning that he might be fishing for something to punish. I guess I was a little thrown off by the crowd, Era admitted. I didn't have time to make a plan, and by the time the fight began, he was already using his quirk. It won't happen again. He was nodding.
Makes sense. You haven't had to fight in front of many other people before. And with the 1v1s, there are less distractions to keep your mind off it.
Repressing the urge to purse her lips, Era recalled that she had, in fact, fought in front of a crowd before. Not one so large, of course, but it had made up for that in rowdiness and general vulgarity. She had a feeling that bringing that up would cause more harm than good. The point was, she was more distracted by what the crowd represented than anything else. Eyes burning into her skin, cameras flashing dazzling spots against her eyes, bright lights and colorful banners, all a stark antithesis of any environment she'd ever worked in. And the watching, the waiting for the wrong person to catch her on screen.
Just keep your focus,
Aizawa continued as they neared the announcing booth. Era could hear Present Mike's voice bounce down the hallway, already excitedly commentating on the next match. It seemed that Ashido and Shiozaki had finished their round, and the festival had moved on to Yaoyorozu and Tokoyami. A shame. She had wanted to see creation in action, although they were just announcing the competitors, so maybe she could still catch it. There were a few windows nearby that she could.
Suzuki?
Fuck. When had her mind become so slippery, drifting through her fingers like sand? She resisted the urge to snap to attention, instead glancing up amiably, expression apologetic. Sorry, I think I drifted a little.
That's fine.
It didn't seem like he was lying, which wasn't necessarily surprising at this point, but did always feel a bit of a shock, like she'd missed a step in the dark.
I was just asking if you've planned at all for your next match.
Era wasn't sure who she was facing next. She'd barely had time to think about her first match, caught up in her observations about Todoroki, and then this whole mess with the cameras. Not yet. Aizawa huffed, pausing to look out the window and down towards the arena. Gratefully, Era took the opportunity to watch as well. The two contestants were just getting in position to start.
I'd think about it. I'm sure Shinsou is.
Era blinked. What?
I said I'm sure. That wasn't what you were asking. You didn't know you were fighting Shinsou next round.
The worst part was that he didn't even sound incredulous at this point, just tiredly resigned. That gnawed Era's pride a bit. She began hotly. It's not as if... Really?
It's on the screen, Suzuki. The brackets are right there. You can see who you'll fight next.
This wasn't her fault. There was no way this was her fault. Because how was she to have known? Cage matches don't work like this. With anything so organized as brackets and tournaments, it was just one fighter in a ring, beating the shit out of another fighter, until one of them couldn't fucking stand anymore. Then they'd bring in the next guy. Rinse and repeat. Not fucking rocket science. She hadn't even considered that they'd be so generous as to give her that information. And so why would she even bother? Oh, fuck. Does Shinsou know that? It looked like Aizawa was resisting the urge to roll his eyes.
Yes. Yes, he does.
Huh. That explained why he'd been acting so odd. Although it also made her feel like a bit of an ass. Of course he was going to act a little weird around her. She'd always been able to beat him in a head-on fight, and it wasn't as if he could use his quirk on What were the fucking odds? The only two general education students fighting each other in the second round of the tournament. Below, Era watched as Tokuyami called upon his strange, shadowy Quirk to strike at Yaoyorozu again and again. She felt her brow furrow as the girl was pushed out of the ring and the match called. With the way the bracket was arranged, either her or Shinsou would have to be barred from the third round. That meant that only one general studies kid could possibly be on the podium. If Aizawa had come to the same conclusion, he didn't voice it. Instead, he seemed intent on the final moments of the match below, eyes narrowing slightly. Yaoyorozu has a confidence issue, remarked Era, pressing a hand against the glass. Aizawa just nodded with a hum and continued to stare down at where she was beginning to walk from the field. And she took his tacit acceptance of her commentary as permission for her to continue. She needs to get better at thinking on the fly. Her quirk is so versatile, but she gets easily bogged down in details and doesn't like deviating from her original plan. She kept making shields there, using her quirk to stay on the defensive, instead of making space for herself and pushing forward.
A logical strategy. It's always best to be prepared, but better still to be able to fight when your plan falls apart. It's good to learn that sooner rather than later, so hopefully she'll come away from this stronger.
This was another lesson. But for the life of her, Era couldn't figure out what it was supposed to be about. Unless she gets herself bogged down by the mistakes, focuses on them, doesn't move past them.
That's what we're here for. We're teachers. If we see her taking the wrong lessons from this, then we'll guide her towards a better conclusion.
Era hummed thoughtfully, watching as Todoroki and Sero took their places in the ring. This one was going to be quick, unfortunately. The terrain did not favor Sero to start with, and against Todoroki it was almost a lost cause. You're concerned that I'll go easy on Shinsou. Let him win. A telling pause.
Yes, I am.
She huffed. I won't. That does neither of us any good. Besides, I think it'd make him hate me forever. Era missed the hint of a smile at his face as she turned back to the match. The two students were set to go, and as midnight called for them to start, Sero immediately shot out a few strands of tape, binding Todoroki and swinging him from the ring until the stadium rumbled with frightful promise, breath misting before her as the temperature plummeted. Era's fingers twitched with
Run away, run far away.
But she forced herself to still, to watch as Todoroki sent a spire of glimmering ice shuddering across the arena and ensnared Sero in thick spikes of glimmering cold. Era released a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding. Overkill.
Agreed.
She nearly startled when Aizawa spoke. With a display below, she'd almost forgotten his presence.
Anything you would have done better?
It felt rhetorical, almost sarcastic, but Era let herself think on it anyway. There was a chance she would face him at some point, right? I think your students need to learn to exploit weaknesses.
That doesn't sound very heroic.
He sounded more amused than scathing, which was the only thing that kept the flinch from Era's shoulders. Instead, she simply shrugged.
A lot of things that heroes have to do don't sound very heroic,
she muttered, eyes fixed on how Todoroki slowly thawed Sero from his icy prison.
They have to be violent sometimes. The fights on the news always feel so sterile. There's no way it's all like that. Things must get ugly.
especially in the underground. And people get killed. Heroes and villains, all the time. There's no such thing as cheating in a fight like that. There are only winners and losers, and the losers usually wind up dead. Heroes lie. Era clenched her jaw, as if that might stop any more inane drivel from spilling out.
That's an interesting perspective.
Really? Fuck. Did she not know how to keep her mouth shut?
Of course. You're right. Heroics isn't all ideals and clear-cut morals. Sometimes there are things you need to sacrifice to get the job done. But Suzuki...
He turned, fixing her with his gaze.
We also have to remember that sometimes the quickest, easiest, most efficient way to get the job done isn't necessarily the right way. Heroes can't let themselves become too accustomed to discarding morality. Society has laws, and we can't hold ourselves above them just because we feel like we know best.
Era snorted. Heroes break laws all the time.
I'm not saying that's right, but those aren't the kind of laws I'm talking about. It's about ethics. What's right and what's wrong.
Fuck. Why did it always come back to ethics? But who makes those rules, then? Era felt her hand move to run through her hair, and quickly forced it to hang loose at her side once more. Who decides? Aizawa frowned.
That's a big question, and I don't have time to discuss it right now. It would be a disservice.
A disservice to what? The man was a teacher. So why did every fucking conversation she had with him lead to more questions than answers? She was probably pushing her luck as it was, so she didn't object to him cutting the conversation short. Or maybe she should? Even with all of her prodding, the backtalk and blatant acts of disrespect, Aizawa had never once retaliated. It wasn't that she wanted him to, but it would be nice to know exactly where the lines were, to find that breaking point she could near but never cross. That was how she'd survived her trainers in Phoenix. A day as important as the sports festival probably wasn't the time to continue testing these waters, however. I should probably get back to my seat, she said at last. Aizawa just nodded, moving to head back into the announcer's booth.
Don't use your gun outside of the competition again. It will be confiscated.
Of course, Sensei. Aizawa just gave another one of his wary sighs, disappearing behind the door and leaving Era alone in the hallway. Walking towards the window, Era took a better look at the screen displaying the brackets. Fuck. She really had to fight Shinsou next round. It looked like after that would be... Well, it depended on who Uraraka was fighting next, which depended on who would win between Kirishima and Asui. Era huffed, watching the two of them take their places on the stage. Asui had range and agility, and the strength to lift Kirishima, even if he used his quirk. It was a poor matchup for him, unfortunately. Not that he couldn't have made up for that with skill, but... The match was over quickly, Asui latching her tongue around Kirishima and throwing him out of bounds. Era winced sympathetically. Yeah, none of these kids were skilled enough to overcome such a severe quirk disadvantage. So she'd be facing whoever won between Asui and Uraraka. Either way, Era was pretty confident she could win. Neither had overwhelming quirks. Although Asui's was certainly strong and versatile, Era had faced worse and come out on top. On the other side of the bracket, all of these kids had powerful quirks. She hadn't seen Shiozaki fight, but Ida's speed let him a starting advantage that he seemed eager to make use of. He would probably win, unless her reaction time was legendary. Tokoyami and Todoroki she was less certain of. Both had powerful quirks, although Todoroki clearly had more training. Fuck, there was that itch again. That feeling she was missing something. Era huffed. That didn't matter. In terms of raw power, Todoroki was the strongest here. She'd likely face either him or Tokoyami if she made it to the finals. And Era was going to make it to the fucking finals. She was going to step up on that podium and look Phoenix right in the eye, spit in their face, and dare them to come after her. The time for subtlety had long passed. Now it was about strength. She couldn't appear weak, not while she was revealing herself. This was on her terms, and they would hesitate before playing a game where she had so clearly set the pieces. At least, she dearly hoped so. End of chapter 36.